what's precluding them from being friendly with these liberal ideas. So back to the question on behavioral difference between civil society in Africa and the West, I suggest to explore 4 intrinsic variables by taking what I call an organic approach. And I would like to focus on just 2 of them by making 2 reflections with the hope that this will provoke new reflections that can enrich my research and also maybe inform how we think about these problems. The first comment I want to make relates to the question of political culture. In my view, again, understanding the workings of civil society in Africa, especially in Rwanda, cannot be decoupled from local value and belief systems and how those have historically blended into the political orientations citizens of Africa have often pulled into. They are strong cultural artifacts which are embedded in historical political practices at both state and non-state actors level that a normative civil society cannot hope to change in a swift manner. Anticipatory obedience to authority in Africa is more cultural than a misusage of rationality in most African societies. Following orders and submission to the supreme authority of the nation is a powerful social characteristic that pervades all spheres of influence. It then makes it dubious that a one-world-propelled civil society can prevail in such settings. So I'm going to skip through very quickly and perhaps speak about the question on the second element I want to cover here is social trust and how it can obstruct or enable civil society. So both the literature have established the connection between social trust and development of democracy in the sense that trust promotes liberal self-expression values and leads to citizens' participation in decision-making. Fukuyama even posits that low-trusting societies are disadvantaged in the realm of development because they're unable to develop large, complex social institutions. In a way, interpersonal trust, tolerance, and participation in decision-making all correlate with democracy. In a sense, building a strong civil society transits through a strong sense of strong trust, civic virtues, and a sense of communal belonging. This is the civic culture that Putnam discovered in northern Italy, or the communal republicanism that Tocqueville ascribed the success of the American political system to. But in Africa, African societies are notorious for fragmentation stemming from ethnic, regional, and political conflicts. Rwanda is the quintessential illustration of the plight of African social fabric. This then raises the question of what does it mean to mobilize civil society constituencies and coalesce them around issues of communal interest when there is no trust? And what does it mean to build a strong civil society in a state where associational life or any other form of group representation on the basis of ethnic identity or minority group is prohibited, when altruistic values have been displaced by self-serving interest, community belongingness outweighed by individual resilience, and material needs are the driver of all civic engagement, then it becomes an impossibility for civil society to be the social capital stronghold. African civil society is also faced with another serious structural challenges. When the most influential civil society are city headquartered and detached from rural communities where 80% of constituencies live, with ongoing clashes between the priorities of donors, civil society organizations, and governments. When civil society organizations do not strategize to be financially self-reliant, but rather continue to operate in a weak economic environment and limited resources, all that leads to poor institutionalization and opportunism, and ultimately creates a dynamic in which states' goals prevail over those of civil society organizations and donors. When civil society / donors accuse African governments not to be good listeners, government respond that civil society / donors do not know how to say things right. When civil society organizations seek to self-impose as intermediaries between state and citizens, states want them to be partners. Recourse to public protest are viewed by state as confrontational and vice versa, which in the end leads to a dichotomy whereby civil society is impatient, is defeated by state pragmatism, and principles are supplanted by political realities. That is why, if we had this spectrum to typify civil society organizations by what they do, we end up with a higher concentration of them on the service delivery side and less on the advocacy end, where things take a sensitive political dimension. The majority of African civil society invest more into insulating the society. Example in Rwanda, where they manage 20% of the in-country annual budget and do not address the state on serious political issues. And for the purpose of our discussion today, the question then becomes whether EU's support to civil society should begin here, where things are more sensitive and complicated, or here, where you have more emphasis on supporting and protecting society. To me, support to civil society in Africa needs to find a perfect balance between services and advocacy, between traditionalism and normative standards, between societal and political aspirations, and to work in the means of the spectrum with the hope that eventually this will widen up further to both extremes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sarah Moth.
No, I don't think so. Yep, it's working, good. So thank you for coming. I am Sarah Motes from FIU. And today I'm going to talk to you about venue shopping and domestic interest groups. So the title of my talk today, Transnational Venue Shopping, the Motivation, Strategy, and Tactics of Organized Interest in a Global World. Now, when we look at that title, that is basically implying that we have numerous actors all working in a very globalized world. So when we think about today's issues, there are so very few issues that are purely domestic. And it's very common for groups to go beyond their domestic political venue in search of additional lobbying targets, but the question is, why? Why, say, does the Canadian Mining Association, why are they so closely worried about American environmental policy? Why, for instance, does the American Farm Bureau, why do they have close connections with foreign governments all across the world? Why does the Irish pro-choice movement, why are they so closely connected with international institutions? So to investigate these questions, I have developed 4 basic questions, 3 of which I'm going to talk to you about today. The first one is motivation. Why? Why bother going outside of your domestic venue? Second, what kind of strategy are you using to access the outside world? Third, what are the tactics? And then fourth, success. And success is iffy. I've had a horrible time trying to figure out how I'm going to measure success. So we're going to leave that one out for now. Typically I say, do you think you're successful? And they say yes. And I say, all right, great. So motivation. The very first thing that you want to talk about when you're looking about groups is, what is their motivating factor? Why are they leaving the domestic venue? And here, I think that we need to go back to our classic literature. Go back to our classic literature on interest groups and look at how and why groups are acting domestically, and that can give us a kind of a foundation of how they are going to act, why they are going to act the way they do internationally. So go back to your classic stuff. Go back to Olson and the logic of collective action. Go back to Wilson and Clark and the incentive systems. Go back to Baumgartner. He's a little bit later on the scene than some of your 1960s guys, but still, he has very important work that tells us about group activity. So in terms of motivation, I think that there are three main motivating factors that pushes a group to leave the domestic venue. Number one, protecting your domestic status quo. In terms of protecting domestic status quo, you have to look at what is going on domestically. When you look at domestic policy and political systems, domestic policy tends to favor status quo. So when you're successful domestically as a group, you tend to favor the status quo, but say that the political climate might be changing. Say the politics might be changing and you are worried. You've had great success domestically, but you're concerned about what the future holds. So you're going to go out into the international world, the transnational world, to try to get a feel for things and protect what's going on at home. Also, challenge domestic status quo. This is where you are completely blocked domestically. You are going nowhere. Thus, you have to find a different avenue to achieve your goals. And this is where our transnational advocacy stuff is so important. This is where you rely on your international allies to try to bring pressure from the outside and pull it back in, pull it back pressure, and try to pressure your domestic government into acting. We see this a lot with environmental policy. We see it a lot with human rights issues. And then third, universal protection. There are some issues in the world that groups feel not only should this be your norm domestically, this should be a universal norm. So humanitarian issues, also a lot of your human rights stuff. So this is the first question, your motivation. Second, I look at the strategies. So basically this is your access. This is how are you going about getting to the international world. So are you sending a representative to meet directly with the foreign government? Are you forming a coalition with groups all across the world in different countries, attending IGO meetings, speaking at one of those meetings? Perhaps you have NGO status, or you're forming coalitions with one of your international NGOs. So what is your strategy? What is your avenue to access? Third, your tactics. And this is really important because domestic interest groups, they have a variety of tactics they use to pressure. So coalition building, written communication, direct, indirect contact, expert testimony. But the real question here is, are they using the same tactics outside of their domestic venue that they are using inside? And with this, it is really important to know your audience, to know your institutions that you are approaching, whether it's political systems, whether it's culture, whether it's political institutions, what is going on, because some of these tactics are going to be a lot more useful than others depending upon your influence, depending upon who you are trying to influence. So how did I pull this together? And this has been a project that I've been working on for a lot of years now. And it's a comparative study. It looks at the United States, looks at Canada, and here recently it looks at European groups. And why comparative? Well, do groups act differently in different countries? So is the groups in the United States, are they more or less likely to leave the domestic venue? What about the Europeans? Are they going to use the same tactics elsewhere that they are using on the European scene? So that is why it's comparative. And then in terms of how I went about the data, and this has been a very, very, very long road, but the data came from personal interviews. I basically would get people on the phone, representatives from various groups, and I would ask them all sorts of questions. It was a pre-designed survey, but I would have questions that I would kind of push them towards answering, but it was basically just a conversation. It was very informal, and as they were talking, I would be scribbling things down, taking shorthand notes. And I would ask them questions about their transnational activity, about their domestic environment. So for instance, how do you view your domestic political environment? Do you have NGO status? How many times a year do you speak at an IGO meeting? Stuff like that. So it was a way to try to get at how they were working domestically, as well as the way they thought of their domestic policy area, and how they were working transnationally. So I have three basic areas that I look at. I look at agriculture policy, and missions policy, environmental stuff, and then reproductive rights. So when I was trying to think today what I want to present to you and how I want to actually showcase this, here recently, within the last few months, I've started working on the European scene. Started really digging into European groups and how they work transnationally. And I stumbled upon the Irish case. And it's very, very unique case, and it's really unique in terms of how the Irish pro-choice movement is using international institutions. So what I thought I would do is just briefly go through the case with you and showcase how they are working. So, in terms of the Irish reproductive policy, I just want to give you a brief history here. Basically, it's complicated, very, very complicated. The Reproductive Policy Law, it's basically based upon the Offences Against the Persons Act. And as you can see there, it's a pretty old policy. It's a British policy that kind of went with Ireland as they gained independence. But basically what this policy says is that it is unlawful to terminate a pregnancy, both for the mother to terminate it and for the physician to terminate it. It is unlawful, and it's a criminal offense, basically. Now, in 1983, the Eighth Amendment was passed to the Irish Constitution. It was passed by referendum, and basically what this says is the life of the mother and the life of the child, they are given equal rights. And what it basically did, the Eighth Amendment gave a constitutional ban on abortion in Ireland. So fast forward to 1992, a young girl, she was about 14 or so, she was seeking an abortion in the United Kingdom. She had been a rape victim, and she was actually stopped and detained and told that she could not go to the UK to obtain the procedure, that criminal charges would be forthcoming. And it worked its way up through the courts, and the Irish Supreme Court said, actually, the Eighth Amendment is not absolute. The Eighth Amendment has limitations, and the life of the mother can be protected. So as a result, the Irish public, they were asked their opinion on a couple different